I'm putting them in small groups for that. So to do it at like a Teams meeting, right? But obviously, so there's those options too, right?
All right, folks going to start to come on in pretty soon. Actually, we're up on now. We'll let the flood come in. And I'll turn it over to obviously to Holly and Forrest when we're ready.
Okay.
I'll be able to take a quick break.
Yeah.
We'll just give everyone a minute while I get here. I do want to just point out for folks that are coming in that, we are recording these sessions. So, for any reason you might have missed one of the earlier sessions this morning, those will be made available to you. So you will have the opportunity to kind of check those out. In other cases, you might just kind of want to circle back. You were here live, but there was this resource referred to, and maybe you didn't catch that. You'll be able to, again, circle back and, take a look and see what that resource was. So these will be available to you later.
Yeah, if you were on our lunch piece and just at our lunch piece, this is now the webinar version. The lunch one was kind of more like meeting version. So it might look a little different, but we're now back into webinar mode. So the big difference is that with webinar mode, you wouldn't be able to unchat, chat, or come off of mic.
Are we ready to get started? Okay.
All right, so we'll just do a quick introduction. So this is going to be our third session for today, going from 1 to 150, student guidance. And for our presenter, we're going to be joined, by Holly Howery. Holly was most recently on the CSCU Board of Regents until June of 2023. And she's now a faculty member at Charter Oak State College, teaching digital and technological literacy. Holly served as a media design engineer, operations engineer, software development technical lead, project manager, program manager, and the head of the global broadcast production and distribution critical solution desk. She currently serves as a consultant and a lead product owner for custom troubleshooting software. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the ball off to Holly.
Thanks, Forrest. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Holly Howery. I spend a lot of time consulting these days on generative AI. It is literally all any business wants to talk about. And I think they have this notion, right, that it's going to replace staff. And the reality is that's not how it's going to work. It's going to shift things. So I am going to share my screen and show my presentation. And really what I'm focusing on today is what students need to know, right? So what do students need to know as they're going through college, as they're looking at their careers about this shift? There's been a lot of media coverage. Much of it has been from the point of view of like, oh my goodness, it's going to take all our jobs. And I think it's scaring students. Also, there was an article on Monday in the Washington Post from the perspective of how a student could prove if if a faculty member accused them of using an AI tool that they didn't. And they were even talking about things like you could screen share your whole writing process and record it so that they know it's true, right? So I think there's a lot of fear on both sides, and I'm going to try to talk about what I think students need to know to be prepared for what's coming next. Here we go. Okay, so what students need to know, and this presentation will be available with the rest of the information at the end of this. This quote was not made up. This quote was actually from Bill Gates, and it took me a minute to find it. But generative AI has the potential to change the world in ways we can't even imagine. It has the power to create new ideas, products, and services that will make our lives easier, more productive, and more creative. It also has the potential to solve some of the world's biggest problems, such as climate change, poverty, and disease. The future of generative AI is bright, and I'm excited to see what it will bring. So there's both pieces, right? There's the excitement side of it. What's it going to be like? What's it going to do next? There's the reality side of it, like what can it do today, right? And then there's the impact, like how is it going to impact us in the future? So I hope you are super excited to look at how you can incorporate Gen AI and AI/ML into your classes, regardless of what you teach. But if you're not, let me give you some reasons why, about what students need to know and why they need to know it, right? Okay, we already know students are going to use this technology. They're already using it in different areas of their life, right? This isn't going to be any different. So what do they need to know, right? Well, this technology can impact everything, right? As Bill Gates was talking about, as Reid Hoffman was talking about, I listened to him on a podcast. I think the source is cited at the end. And he said within 5 years, it will touch every job, right? Generative AI will touch every job. And there are ways that it'll do that, but it doesn't mean it will erase every job, right? And students need to know that the technology as it exists today is limited. So we've been talking about that, right? Chat GPT hasn't been up, the large language model hasn't been updated since 2021. Ask it a current fact, it doesn't know it, right? There are way more limitations than just that, but students, I don't think, have any idea necessarily how these things work. They just see it maybe as a shortcut. So students need to learn how to use it, right? So if they're going to be using this in their careers, and we have pretty, decent, experienced people telling us this is a pivot point, right? Then I think, we can't ignore it, right? And was discussed in a lunch session, if you were there, it becomes an equity issue, right? So if students didn't grow up with a computer with internet access in their home, right? Didn't have regular access to that, how far behind, how much inequity do we lock in by not giving them access to some of this technology now? And finally, students need to understand the risks. Listen, there's a lot of great promising things coming in the future with this technology. And there's a lot of cautionary tales and understanding, I think, that has to go into that. And we need our students to understand that, right? We need them to know the risks of putting it in there because they're going to be asked to use it, right? And I think when I think of this pivot point, right? When I was young, I watched a movie in the 80s called 9 to 5, right? It opens with this huge scene of this enormous floor in New York City in a building, and it's full of all of these largely women typing with stenophones in their ears, right? It was the secretarial pool. And didn't know that personal computers were coming and was going to wipe that all out, right? But I can tell you the good news is women aren't sitting at home on unemployment, right? We got better jobs. We got more interesting work. We get to use our brains more, people who were in the secretarial profession and in other professions as a result of this change. It was a net good, but it was a painful change, I'm sure, for some people. So, right. So how do we look forward for our students and help them see what the change is going to be so they're not on the painful side of it? So I'm teaching technical literacy. It's a foundational course at Charter Oak. And it kind of looks at, some of these basic skills, right? How do you work with a team that's virtual, right? How do you use audio and video technology, right? What is big data? What does that mean, right? What is generative AI and how can I use it, right? So this is Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI. OpenAI supports ChatGPT and built the model. And he said, like all technical revolutions, right? I expect there to be a significant impact on jobs. But exactly what that impact looks like is very difficult to predict. I believe that there will be a far greater job loss on the there'll be far greater jobs on the other side of this, and that the jobs of today will get better. I think it's important to understand and think about GPT-4 as a tool, not a creature, which is easy to get confused. And it's a tool that people have a great deal of control over how they use it. And second, GPT-4 and other systems like it are good at doing tasks, not jobs, right? And so, how do we incorporate more of those job-like assignments for our students and less of the task-like assignments? So why is new technology important, right? Why do we want to stay away from that DeLorean from earlier? Well, because it's going to shift to these new opportunities, right? And we need to prepare our students for that. They're not going into the workplace they were going into 5 years ago, right? They're going into a different workplace. And how do we help them use these as tools? Right. Also, just like the secretarial pool is gone, some jobs are going to be greatly reduced, and it's going to hit in interesting areas. Right. And so when students look forward to what's coming and what's shifting, where can those new jobs be found, right? What skills do they need to upskill before they leave college to be prepared for that? One of the things when I first started researching this that I found fascinating is how much even generative AI already exists in some of the products we're using, right? A big one in software development is GitHub. And it's a software design tool, right? The people who write code, the software developers, they write code in there. It now there's a mode you turn it in that can prompt you with what it thinks the next line of code should be, right? And it's doing that based on AI ML, and to some degree, it will continue doing it with large language model support and generative AI. Do we lose software developers? How do their jobs change? Does it just become more interesting? Is it less tedious? Right. And so those are kind of the points, right? When Sam Altman talks about less task, that it's good at tasks, but not jobs. It's not going to release software for you, right? It's not going to do all that. But what part of the tedious and mundane pieces can it take care of, right? People change when they see the value in it. Part of getting students up to date on technology is having them not be afraid of it, right? And to see the value of it in their careers. There is a huge divide between people who are digitally literate, people who have technology skills, and people who don't in the workforce. We talked about that over lunch. We don't want to make that divide bigger. We want to make it smaller, right? We want everyone to have opportunities. So that goes back. Database decision making. It's one of the things that I think scares people, right? What the heck does big data mean? And it's not as scary, but some of this stuff is all tied together, right? Generative AI, like we discussed, is going to have a role in coaching and training, right? So right now, if you want a coach, to teach you to be a better leader or to teach you a skill, that's an expensive ask for a company. Having some level of coaching be available to any employee who wants it is a really attractive idea for a lot of companies out there. And like I said, they need a foundation of technology for anything, and they need to see this as tools. So what do students need to learn? Right? That they need to be lifelong learners. I'm not going to teach students this fall the skills that they need 5 years from now, right? But I'm hopefully going to teach them how to learn the skills they need and that they don't need to be afraid of it, right? So that research piece, that Wikipedia is not a real source piece, right? How to discern, right? What is good writing? What is good research? What constitutes acceptable use, right? That's huge. You know, that as the models get more efficient, as the tools come out, right? It's going to be amazing what we're going to be able to do with that. And maybe that leaves them more time to do the thinking work that AI/ML is not capable of doing today. Listen, it doesn't think. And I'll explain that in a minute. It looks like it thinks, but it doesn't actually think, right? And also students need to know what not to use Gen AI for today, right? And then those substantive, legal, ethical, and bias realities that are baked in to it right now. So generative AI as a tool. Um, I love this quote because it's again from Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, right? They created ChatGPT and they keep doing the research on it. And even he says ChatGPT is incredibly limited, but good enough at some things to create a misleading impression of greatness. And that is so true. It's a mistake to be relying on it for anything important right now. It's a preview of progress. We have lots of work to do on the robustness and truthfulness. And I don't know that we're hearing enough of that when we look, when we hear, conversations about how it's going to take all of our jobs over, right? And all of our industries. I don't think we're hearing enough about the downsides right now and the current limitations. So I think that's an important piece. We heard this morning about large language models, right? They're enormous, right? You can't download one on your laptop to run your own, not today anyway. Although in that same podcast, Reid Hoffman was talking about how they're continuing to slim down the amount of space necessary for them. In the case of ChatGPT, that large language model, which is full of all of those words, isn't live. It doesn't have any access to the internet, which makes it dated. And also it's important to know that all of it is based on data we put out there, right? Somebody wrote it. And as people, we generally have a history of bias. And so if we have a biased data set, the answers come out with that bias. In fact, in some cases, it gets amplified, right? So how do we control for some of that? And finally, there's more than one LLM. There's more than one. There's Meta has their own, Google has their own, right? OpenAI has their own. I'm not sure which one Bing is using. Oh, Bing has their own, yeah. And so they all work differently. They all may have different data sets, right? They all may have different rules. And so putting a prompt in one doesn't mean you're getting the best answer necessarily. It kind of depends. So we kind of talked about some of this, some of the popular tools. ChatGPT 3.5 is free, 4 requires a subscription. Grammarly Go is currently, it has a subscription, but there is a Grammarly free model that doesn't include all the functionality. Claude's pretty good at writing. I gave an example earlier, I think over lunch. There was a technical problem with a client on Monday and people were pretty frustrated. And I did 3 or 4 prompts to get Claude to write me a haiku about the frustration and everybody laughed. It's writing haikus and it made sense, right? So what's the good use of that besides making my coworkers laugh, right? And making my clients laugh, right? So Bard is Google's tool, Bing is Microsoft's tool. Listen, having it incorporated into Bing and Google, into Microsoft and Google has probably shaved a decade off how long it's going to take to make them more functional. And again, that came from Reid Hoffman, right? He asked his OpenAI tool how long it was going to be before it stopped hallucinating. And the AI tool told him 20 years. But because of the massive number of users on Google and Microsoft, they think that'll shave it down to 5. So 95% accurate in 5 years. And then there's popular research tools, right? There are some of these that are like really geared toward people doing their PhD, right? And how does it help you with your research? And so dozens more every day. Every day. There's a great site, I think I included it in the end slide, that just kind of ranks the tools that came out today, right? It lists the tools that came out today. So there's going to be one in almost every flavor to do almost anything we want it to do. Some of the things it does well, right? You can feed it an audio recording of a lecture or a business meeting. It'll summarize it. It'll write you minutes for it. It'll write the data to a file, right? You can upload that file, specify the format. It does all that sort of thing. It's pretty good at analyzing data sets, right, into a table or paragraph. You can tell it what you're uploading. Again, it comes down to the prompts, right, and have it do some analysis. I think hopefully Forrest is going to talk about some uses he's had for that as well, right? So maybe some of the, again, more mundane tasks of analyzing large data sets to find the information we're looking for. Research, right? Again, finding data sets, right? Finding access to information. I did grow up in an era where I was sent to the library for the card catalog, right? It has changed so much. How do we use the best of that and leave the worst of it on the table? And translating, I think it was Colleen who talked this morning about a universal translator. It's not that far away, right? Okay, so it's fabulous. We're all on board. What's the problem? Well, it hallucinates, right? And so what does that mean? It means it wants to answer your question, and sometimes it just makes stuff up, like sources, right? There are some tools for faculty when grading papers that can make it easy to find if those sources are real. But if you ask a tool like ChatGPT, right, if the sources are real on a paper that it helped you write, it will double down and tell you, of course, they're real, right? That's not the tool that's going to find that problem, right? And I just wonder how many students are going to get tired of having to go back to the well to fix the things that ChatGPT writes for them or Claude writes for them to try to make it acceptable to get a good grade. So number two, it is guessing. It does not actually know what words mean. It understands context relative to other words in a sentence, but it doesn't know what they mean, right? And so when we think of it as thinking, and I go back to Sam Altman's, it's good enough to fool you into thinking it does more than it does, right? So all it's doing is making a mathematical calculation and guessing the next right word, right? It's pulling data off the web and it's throwing it there, but it doesn't understand, right? So going back to that, like, how do we incorporate things for students to do so that they understand the difference between good uses and bad uses? How do we use it as a tool to reduce the mundane, to allow them to have more time in analysis, in thinking, in creating, right? If it's doing everything based on the past, it's not going to get us to the future, at least not yet. And then we already talked about some of the models are limited, right? Some more limited than others. And I have found some of the tools don't mention that, right? So students, find the latest tool of the day that they think might be the answer to all their problems. It may not even tell them that it's out of date, right? So students hearing that from us, students understanding from us that there are potentially great advantages to reduce some mundane work. But right now it's not exactly ready for prime time always, right? So how do we get those core skills so that they understand the difference, right? All right. This one is from Tom Galway, and he's one of the chief technologists at Hewlett Packard. The danger of generative AI is that it lacks the ability to understand misinformation, leading to incorrectly equating correlation with causation based on incomplete and inaccurate data, or the lack of contextual awareness required to understand sensitive dependencies between data sets. The unintended consequence is technology shaping societal views on politics, culture, and science. And I think that's a really important distinction that may be lost, especially on first-year students, right? It's full of misinformation. Sometimes it makes stuff up, right? How much work are you going to put into fact checking it? right? How much do you want to? So where is it good, right? Can we manage what is good? And can we help our students understand what's bad? I think Colleen talked about it. There is a website. And I think I actually have the report in my class for the Algorithmic Justice League, right? And they came out and were the first to blow the whistle on facial recognition, right? Because it was tested with the pictures the largely white men had available to them at the time. And it is actually 10 to 100 times more likely to misidentify Asian and Black faces. And there's also a difference between Caucasian women and Caucasian men in the degree of accuracy, right? And it just gets worse as you look at some of the other Asian and Black faces, right? So what does that mean? Well, police stations are using this recognition. Like some of the border patrol people are using this recognition software, and it's dangerous. People end up in holding cells as a result of facial recognition software that inaccurately identified them, right? So we thought people were inaccurate, right? Turns out people are inaccurate, and technology is building off of what people have done and what people know. So Joy called this out, has a whole organization dedicated to stopping this, right? It's getting better than it was in 2019, in large part because of the work that organization is doing, but we're not there yet, and it's not really stopping other data sets. Okay, Amazon. This was fun. So in 2015, Amazon decided to put all of their HR in the cloud and automate hiring people. And what they found is, so what they did is they went back and put all of the data for the successful candidates that they've had in the last 10 years into the system, right? And they said, okay, find us candidates like this. To know, like, so I think at this point, you probably are not surprised at what happened next. It largely went out and found white guys, right? And in fact, it was more biased than the hiring process had been, because so many of the successful candidates in the past had benefited from systemic discrimination, right? And so then it goes up, and it makes it even worse. And there was actually a study on it, and it showed that, in fact, if you were a woman who graduated from Smith College, it wasn't going to hire you because it hadn't found a successful candidate from Smith College in its data set. So things like that, right? Unintended consequences. And I think it's really important that we help our students understand what those unintended consequences can be, because we don't need to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. There are, Bing is one of them, some companies that are working to be better at this, right? To try to eliminate the bias in particular, but we're so not there yet, right? So it's important, I think, for students to understand that and to question it. Right? We can't just put prompts into Chat GPT and expect fully formed papers to come out. That, I don't know how many times they say it, that's not how that works, right? And our students need to understand that too, right? All right, data privacy. So as most people who have worked in large companies and even small companies know, personally identifiable information is a problem. And our own personally identifiable information is a problem, right? So the cautioning students not to upload their social security numbers, really good idea. There are browser plugins that will mask any personally identifiable information that you attempt to put into some of these systems, right? But as I think Colleen may have said, you'd be surprised what's already out there. Like, who celebrates their birthday on Facebook, right? Now we know how old you are. Now we know your birth date. Now we know what year you were born, right? So the unintended consequences of not having a data policy in this country have led to enormous amounts of personal information being available on the web. Also, there is a systemic inequity and digital divide, right? So we already know there's a huge problem between earners at the top and the bottom, and it breaks out in different ways, by certainly by race, by socioeconomic standard, by gender, right? In some cases by religion. That's a huge problem, right? So how are we teaching our students to work with that and to understand that, right? That can come up in almost any conversation, right? And if we're not preparing our students to be part of the future, what are we leaving them, right? What are our students leaving by not doing it? And that goes back to people who didn't grow up with this technology, might be afraid of it, might think they can't learn it, right? How do we bridge that divide? It's such a key issue, I think, when it comes to what students need to learn. All right, we also touched on this earlier, but super important. There are lawsuits all over the place regarding copyright and trademark infringement, right? So if you go say, oh, well, here's a picture of my dog and I want you to make it into a painting in Salvador Dali style, right? Who owns that? Do I own it? Do the people who own the rights to Dali own that? Like, who owns that? And as was discussed earlier, there's already somewhat of a generational problem of people thinking if I can find it on the internet, it's free, right? I can use it whenever I want. And so that goes back to, like, we cite our sources, right? We give credit where credit is due. And just because you can find the Barbie movie online doesn't mean it's free, and doesn't mean there's no cost associated with violating that trademark and violating the copyright that goes with it, right? And so are we making sure that people understand that? Because having worked in broadcasting for a long time and having dealt with music streaming, when it went from not a thing to very much a thing, right? And who has the rights, and what rights do you have, and how did you pay for them? The unintended consequence of messing up legal aspects of original work or not original work, right, can be huge. And so at least having an awareness that that's an issue is super important. And then I think I had the same thing twice. And finally, copyright and trademark infringements, also the same thing. Look at this. When I redid this slide, I had a different format. I must have double copied it. So sorry about that. But yeah, so there's a lot that goes into it, right? There's a lot our students need to understand before they use these tools, right? And they're going to use these tools. They need to use these tools. And if they're not using these tools, they're falling behind their peers, and they're not going to be ready for the jobs they want in the 21st century, right? And I was trying to, so some of the examples that I heard, I was listening to Kara Swisher interview a gentleman who was doing, they're doing a personal assistant. And so the idea is everybody has a personal assistant in the form of a using a large language model, but it spends all day listening to you. So think Alexa, but way, way, way smarter, right? And so it knows what you like, it knows what you don't like, it knows where you go, it knows everything about you, right? And so their idea of the future is you just say, hey, I need a doctor's appointment for my physical with my primary care. And your personal assistant bot goes out and connects with the outward facing bot at your doctor's office and negotiates when you will take that, appointment based already on everything it knows about you. And it gets scheduled on your calendar and you go, right? Talking about reducing some of the mundane things. Now, if it could only process my insurance claims for me, that would be super helpful. So that's one version of the future. They believe in healthcare that every doctor will have a chatbot in their pocket, right? Giving them additional information. When it's connected to the internet one day, the latest information on studies and research about a topic they're discussing with a patient. Already, I think many of us have gone to a primary care and had them look something up while they're talking to you, right? It's going to get way more efficient. And I don't know about you, I had a great primary care physician. She was older, and watching her type was painful. When they switched over to electronic records, right? She was definitely a hunt and pecker, and I think we spent more time watching her type than dealing with my health. So all of that can go away, right? It can just be listening and can take all of its notes. No more need for a scribe. We can use those resources in other ways. So those are just some of the ways that they think this is going to come into the workforce and will impact all of us, right? I was trying to think the other night of what industry it's not going to impact, and I really have a hard time coming up with that, right? So I know there are some of us who are hesitant, but from a student perspective, I think it's really important that we find ways to help them learn how to use the technology and how to grow with it and how to just be committed to being lifelong learners on the technology space. And to the point that was made in one of the earlier sessions about some of our students, living in that digital divide, right? Who may not have access to the hardware and the internet and the software. Like, that's an issue we need to continue to bring forward, right? What are we as an institution doing about that? I know that's a hugely important topic to the board. And then also beyond our digital divide in the United States, right? There's going to be a massive digital divide in different countries, right? So which countries have access to what tools, and how do we help raise all ships, right? How do we use these tools to raise everything up? We haven't been all that successful at doing that up till now. So I think when Bill Gates talks about like this will help us solve climate change with new ideas, in part maybe if we figure out how to bridge that gap, that we'll have more opportunities, that we'll have more dialogue around some of that as well. So I talked too fast. I'm sorry about that. If you're listening, I hope that you reduce the speed to 0.75. But if you're live here, I am happy to answer questions. And there's something in the Q&A and there's a bunch of stuff in the chat, which I couldn't see while I was doing slides. So I'm going to look at those now. In addition to internet access divide, I don't know, a browser add-on that blocks a required email to join something like ChatGPT. So I don't know that there's one that requires it to block it. There are services that you can use though that'll create a one-time use email address. And so I'll pass on some of that information, right? And I know Apple has some of those features built in, but I will find a plugin for that. But they create one-time use email addresses, or they create a throwaway email address you can use that you don't really look for unless you need a password reset. In your opinion, how do we teach students to balance the use of these tools versus using the vast number of electronic resources available at our college and university libraries? Like, this isn't, and it can't be a replacement for our online libraries, right? Finding appropriate sources is a huge part of what we teach, right? Not all data is equal. And I fear, based on some things that have happened in society recently, that we're losing that, right? That there are facts, right? There are things that are peer reviewed. How do we uphold those standards, right? And I really think the show your work is important too, right? If you're going to incorporate like ChatGPT or another large language model lesson, that they show their work, right? It's not just okay to paste something into a discussion board or into an assignment and not credit it and not show your work. So I think those are some of the ways, right? And I think we need to teach students to question, right? The easy answer is to say, well, it's not my fault that source isn't real. That's what Bing told me, right? That those are not acceptable answers, right? We're held accountable for how we found the information. We're held accountable for the information we use. Like, those are academic standards. And I think we're all going to have to be open and work together to figure out what works best. Largely, this conversation is based on what we think is going to work this fall, and a bunch of people are going to try it, and some people have already tried it, but how does it work for us, right? How is it working in our classrooms? May they be virtual or hybrid or on ground? And I think it's really important that we continue having these conversations. We've already come up with questions that we didn't think of on our own, right? About what's going to happen next. So those are in the Q&A. Does anybody else have a question that?
I know Kelly Fast had her hand up and I
Oh, okay.
inadvertently lowered it. So I'm going to go
That's
ahead
okay.
and, Kelly, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. So if you want to ask your question.
And Kelly, I love that quote.
All right, Kelly, I have you on mute. So if you want to unmute and you can ask your question.
Yeah, that was the only thing I wanted to share. Thanks.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks
Yeah.
for
I
posting
put
that.
it in the chat.
That's awesome. I love that quote, right? And I love the idea that the more mundane aspects of my life can be done by something else, right? And there's a cost for that, right? The cost is in my personal data. The cost is in, right, my willingness to let it be wrong. And I will go back to what Reid Hoffman said. He thinks we're 5 years away from it being 95% accurate. That means 5 years from now, not today, it'll only make stuff up 5% of the time, right? So I don't think that gets enough airplay. And our students need to understand that they're taking a huge risk by using it. And I think there's a great article from a few weeks ago, actually a couple months ago, a lawyer submitted a brief to a judge, and none of the cases existed in the brief because he let ChatGPT write it. Oh, that's awesome. There you go. Right. Here's the article. Perfect. So like we need to be really, I think, upfront and honest about what it can't do. Right. And that it's a tool that's going to get better and better and better in the future. And it's going to be very important. I remember working with a woman and she refused to give up her typewriter back in the early 90s. She was not going to learn any of this. And you know what do you do if you're not going to learn it? Right. So at least we can do is give you the opportunity.
And actually, Holly, there's one point actually on the one about the law briefcase. I was with a high-powered attorney at an event, and I brought up that thing about AI, and he actually had a very interesting observation. He goes, I'm actually not too upset with the person that did it. I'm upset with the senior lawyer who overlooked it as well.
Oh, yeah. Right.
In that he said that the job of a senior attorney is to
verify
the work of the junior attorney, and it was the junior attorney who did that. And it actually, in a way, kind of almost brought up as far as one of the questions kind of during lunch session was, hey, this student went ahead, they got away with it, they were bragging about it. And part of it was the professor checking the accuracy of the content. And so it kind of reminded me that type of equivalency.
We did have a comment here in the chat I want to just highlight. Chris mentioned that, to provide a skeptic's perspective, teaching students how to understand and evaluate large language models is not a tech skill, but a liberal arts skill. Chris, I got to tell you, I don't think it's skeptical. I think that is a pragmatic and really smart point, right?
Yeah.
To me, that is 100% why you all as faculty matter, why you're essential, because this tool has value, but holy cow, like it could go off the rails very easily unless we're teaching those critical reading, critical thinking, critical questioning skills that help us determine and discern the quality of what that thing is putting out, right? So I don't think that that's the least bit cynical. I think that that's an important measuring stick that we have to kind of just keep in our hands at all times. Just soapboxing there, sorry.
Yeah, and I think every discipline, has different issues with this tool, right? Which is why I think it's important that like it gets addressed by all of us. All of us have a perspective. All of us are going to try. So back to the big data model for a minute. All of us are just going to try stuff this fall, right? And let's bring all the data back and find out what worked and find out what didn't, and then go try more stuff, right? That's how we learn too. I made fun of Amazon for thinking it could hire people automatically. But if anyone has tried to find a job in the last 2 or 3 years, you will know that most hiring processes are broken, and they're broken in large part because of AI, right? AI and ML, for a whole lot of reasons. But there's a whole group of people qualified who can't get their foot in the door And there's a whole group of people looking to hire them who aren't getting their candidates. Some of it comes down to simple things like keyword matching. And some of it comes down to the same idea that Amazon blew out on almost a decade ago, is how some of the processes work in some of the HR systems. They train it on 10 years worth of data, and then they go in and they're surprised when it doesn't solve their equity problems, right?
We also had another comment from Valerie in the Q&A about regarding the 20-year estimate, in terms of increasing the accuracy and the reduction of hallucinations, making the point that there is a difference between hallucinated, made up data and inaccurate data.
Yeah, so I don't know how we ever get rid of some of the really inaccurate data, right? Does a large language model, if it doesn't understand what words mean, how does it understand disinformation? It doesn't, right? It doesn't understand its own disinformation, but it certainly doesn't understand other people's disinformation, right? And are all facts equal? Have I scared you now? We should scare students a little, just a little. Get them to use it, but scare them just a little, right? It is, right? Cynthia, I totally agree with you. Cynthia wrote scary in terms of diversity and inclusion, garbage in, garbage out, right? And there are a whole lot of people who believe that because a computer told it to them, it is accurate and unbiased. And as somebody who has worked in technology for a long time, specifically in software engineering for the last decade, right? I can tell you that computers make decisions based on what programmers tell them to, and programmers are people, and people are biased. All of us, it's how our brains work. They make little shortcuts. They're not all bad, but some of the things we have in our heads are really pretty messed up.
And Holly, actually, I see that in the chat there from Karen about practicum and client files and things of that nature. And as a follow-up to what you said, is I think you had a spot on, which is about just the proper amount of fear. So in that scenario, for example, Karen, is I would maybe share the scenario of the case that the lawyer did, and showed the domino effect of not checking the information, and how. And it's probably going to happen sometime in the near future in the practicum set, and if it hasn't already. And I would actually use those stories as lessons learned to students on why you don't go ahead and just do that.
Well, and then so that in many industries, there's specific laws about PII too, right? So FERPA, HIPAA, right? We can't just upload a bunch of data. Like, that's not going to be okay. And that's a huge, and I'll tell you, I started this by saying, as a consultant, everybody wants to talk about generative AI, everybody, right? We hear it all the time, and you make a proposal and they're in love with it. And then they come back and they're like, my IT department said no, right? Security is a huge issue. It's going to continue to be one too. And then we'll see what happens in the legislature, right? If they ever decide they can come together and decide what data privacy standards matter. And if you work for a global company, you've got to be careful about what the European Union has already done with data standards. Okay, now I'm done scaring them, Dave. Are there any other questions before I let you go actually have a decent break for a minute? While waiting for a policy or guidance document, it might be helpful to have a one-page checklist for students. That is a great idea. Whoever that person is, that is a great idea. There's a whole bunch of data privacy standards. I'm happy to include it with the information that we sent. They restrict what information you can catalog and how you can follow people. Happy to send you a link on that.
I would also just kind of put a plug in for the respective Centers for Excellence Teaching and Learning, or Office of Teaching and Learning for CT State. I know, at least for us, within the professional development newsletter that we send out bi-monthly, we're putting in a lot of different resources related to this. I can also just kind of give you a bit of a spoiler alert for the mid-late August edition. We're going to have some really interesting guidance in terms of for other universities that are going out there and giving guidance for students in terms of the level of AI support that should or should not be involved in a particular assignment. It's got a nice little kind of like a visual key code for that, in terms of just different considerations that you want to have, some examples of policies that you may want to consider for your class. just resources to help you find some further direction in this kind of murky world that we're working our way through.
And I can tell you, as a multiple graduate of Charter Oak, I did over 100 credits between grad school and undergrad at Charter Oak. It can get really lonely as a student in an online classroom, and so that's why we, starting to incorporate small groups, starting to incorporate that aren't necessarily doing group assignments, that are working together, right? And like using video and audio. Super excited to see what Blackboard's doing for us, right? Some of that really can take the bot out of the back end when you start getting to know people online, right? And creating that community. Absolutely. Thank you all. I love the idea of a one page. We'll bring that back and see what we can do. David's already writing it, I see, on his computer. So appreciate all of you. Have a great one, and we'll see you back at 2 o'clock for the final session. Have a good one. Thanks.